In the dusty frontier town of Silver Creek, Arizona, 1887, an Apache warrior named Naalnish stands on the gallows platform, his hands bound behind his back. The townspeople have gathered to witness what they believe will be justice served, the execution of a man they call a savage rebel. But Naalnish has made one final request that even his captors cannot refuse: to see his wife and 3 children one last time before the rope takes his life. As the sun begins its descent behind the desert mountains, casting long shadows across the makeshift execution ground, his family arrives. His wife, Aiyana, clutches their youngest child while their 2 older sons stand silent beside her. The reunion is heartbreaking, a man facing death, embracing the family he fought so hard to protect. But as the moment of execution approaches, something happens that no one could have predicted. What occurred next would be talked about for generations, challenging everything the witnesses thought they knew about life, death, and the power of love. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 weeks earlier, the morning mist clung to the Chiricahua Mountains like spirits reluctant to leave the earth. Naalnish crouched behind a cluster of mesquite, his weathered hands gripping a ceremonial arrow that had belonged to his grandfather. The arrow's shaft was carved with symbols telling the story of his people's connection to this sacred land, symbols that would soon be broken along with everything else he held dear. Below in the valley, a small band of Apache families moved slowly through the desert landscape, their few possessions loaded onto weary horses and traveled. These were not warriors but refugees, elderly grandmothers, young mothers with infants, children who had never known a time when soldiers didn't hunt their people like animals. They were making their way toward the Mexican border, toward a freedom that seemed as distant as the stars. Naalnish had appointed himself their guardian, though he knew the odds were against them all. For months, the U.S. Army had been rounding up Apache families, forcing them onto reservations where disease and despair waited like patient predators. Those who resisted faced imprisonment or death. Those who submitted faced a slower kind of dying. The sound of hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls, and Naalnish's heart tightened. Through the morning haze, he could see them, a patrol of cavalry soldiers accompanied by local militiamen, their blue uniforms and civilian clothes, creating a patchwork of authority that had become all too familiar in recent years. Captain Morrison led the column, a man whose reputation for brutality toward Apache people had earned him both fear and hatred across the territory. Naalnish counted the riders, 15 men, well-armed and mounted on fresh horses. His own band consisted of 3 other warriors, all of them armed with rifles that had seen better days and ammunition that was running dangerously low. The math was simple and unforgiving, but mathematics had never governed the choices of those who fought for their people's survival. He watched as the patrol split into 2 groups, one circling wide to cut off the family's escape route, while the other prepared for a direct assault. The tactic was efficient and would be effective against an undefended group of refugees. But Morrison hadn't counted on Naalnish and his companions, hadn't expected resistance from what his intelligence reports described as a harmless band of stragglers. The attack began at dawn, just as the first rays of sunlight painted the desert floor in shades of gold and crimson. Morrison's men charged from 2 directions, their war cries echoing off the canyon walls as they sought to overwhelm their targets through speed and shock. But instead of finding helpless families, they encountered withering gunfire from concealed positions that Naalnish had carefully chosen during the night. The battle lasted 3 hours, a running fight through arroyos and over rocky ridges where every boulder and cactus became potential cover. Naalnish moved like a ghost through terrain he had known since childhood, appearing long enough to fire accurate shots before vanishing into landscape that seemed to swallow him whole. His ceremonial arrow remained strung to his bow, held in reserve for a moment that would demand something more than bullets. When the moment came, it arrived with the sudden clarity that combat veterans recognize, that instant when chaos crystallizes into perfect understanding. Captain Morrison had cornered 2 Apache children behind a fallen log, his pistol trained on a boy no older than 10, while the child's sister cowered beside him. The captain's face showed the cruel satisfaction of a man about to commit an act he would later justify as military necessity. Naalnish rose from behind a cluster of prickly pear, his grandfather's arrow nocked and drawn in one fluid motion. The shot crossed 40 yards in less than a heartbeat, the arrow finding its mark with the precision that had made Naalnish legendary among his people. Morrison dropped his weapon and staggered backward, more from shock than injury, as the arrow pinned his sleeve to a wooden fence post without breaking his skin. It was a warning shot, a demonstration of skill that spoke louder than words. But it was also a mistake, because it revealed Naalnish's position to the remaining soldiers. Within minutes, they had him surrounded, their rifles trained on him from positions that made escape impossible. The ceremonial arrow lay broken on the ground where Morrison had snapped it in half, its carved symbols fractured beyond repair. As the soldiers bound his hands with rough rope, Naalnish looked toward the mountains where his people had once lived free, where his ancestors' spirits still walked among the ancient stone. The capture felt like more than the end of his personal freedom. It felt like the breaking of something sacred that could never be fully mended. The families he had protected continued their journey toward Mexico, their freedom purchased with his capture. As the soldiers led him away in chains, Naalnish could hear the sound of children's laughter carried on the desert wind, a reminder that some victories were measured not in personal survival, but in the lives preserved through sacrifice. Captain Morrison rode beside the prisoner, his uniform sleeve still showing the precise hole where Naalnish's arrow had passed through. "You could have killed me," the captain said, his tone mixing respect with puzzlement. Naalnish looked at him steadily. "Yes," he replied in careful English, "but killing you would not have saved those children. Only letting them go would do that." The captain fell silent, perhaps understanding for the first time that he was dealing with a different kind of enemy than the savage his superiors had described. As they rode toward Silver Creek and the justice that awaited there, Morrison found himself wondering what kind of man chose mercy over revenge, even when surrounded by those who would show him none in return. The blessing ceremony concluded the morning's extraordinary events, transforming what had begun as an execution into something more like a reconciliation service. Silent Hawk's family prepared for their departure from Cedar Ridge, carrying with them the community's cautious hope that peace between Apache and white settlements might be possible. Before leaving town, Sarah removed a silver locket from her neck, a piece of jewelry she had worn throughout her years among the Apache as a connection to her childhood in Cedar Ridge. The locket contained a small photograph of her parents, taken shortly before her disappearance, a memento she had treasured as her only link to her original family. "Johnny," Sarah said, placing the locket in her brother's hands, "I want you to keep this as a bridge between my past and my future. When you look at it, remember that love can survive separation, that families can endure even when they live in different worlds." John Bennett accepted the locket with hands that trembled slightly, understanding that his sister was entrusting him with something precious that represented hope for continued connection, despite the distances that would separate them. The photograph inside showed their parents as young people, full of hopes and dreams that had been tested by tragedy, but ultimately validated by Sarah's survival and happiness. As Silent Hawk's family mounted their horses for the journey to the territorial agency, Little Fox turned back toward the crowd of Cedar Ridge residents who had witnessed the morning's remarkable events. His young face showed maturity beyond his years, shaped by experiences that few children his age would ever encounter. "Thank you," Little Fox said, his clear voice carrying across the gathered townspeople, "for letting my father live to teach me how to build peace instead of war." The child's gratitude, expressed with dignity that impressed even those residents who remained skeptical about Apache character and intentions, provided a fitting conclusion to the morning's transformation from planned execution to unexpected reconciliation. 6 months later, the first formal peace treaty between Cedar Ridge and the local Apache bands was signed in a ceremony held at the Territorial Agency, where Silent Hawk worked as a cultural liaison and conflict mediator. The agreement established protocols for trade, resource sharing, and dispute resolution that served as a model for similar arrangements throughout the territory. Silent Hawk's role as mediator between Apache leaders and territorial officials had proven invaluable in preventing conflicts that could have escalated into warfare. His understanding of both cultures, combined with his reputation for honesty and fair dealing, made him an effective negotiator who earned respect from representatives of both communities. What they do instead will challenge everything the townspeople believe about justice, honor, and the true meaning of courage. Could one Apache's final wish change an entire town's understanding of right and wrong? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun climbed higher over Cedar Ridge, casting harsh light on weathered faces that had seen too much violence and too little mercy. Sheriff Morrison adjusted the tarnished silver badge on his vest, a star passed down from his father and grandfather before him, each man who wore it bearing the weight of keeping law in a land that often forgot what justice truly meant. Morrison had worn that badge for 12 years, through cattle rustlings and claim disputes, through the occasional drifter who thought Cedar Ridge might be an easy mark. But nothing in those 12 years had prepared him for the responsibility he carried today. The weight of that star seemed heavier with each step he took toward the crowd gathering around the gallows. The gallows themselves stood as a monument to frontier certainty. Built from sturdy oak and reinforced twice over the years, they had served their purpose 11 times since the town's founding. Today would make 12, if everything proceeded as planned. The weathered hemp rope swayed gently in the morning breeze, a constant reminder that some actions carried consequences from which there could be no return. Cedar Ridge had earned its reputation as a town that didn't tolerate lawlessness. Settlers had carved this community from wilderness through sheer determination and mutual protection. When threats arose, whether from wild animals, harsh weather, or hostile forces, the people of Cedar Ridge faced them together with resolve that brooked no compromise. That resolve had built their churches, their school, their businesses, and their gallows. The Apache raids had tested that resolve more than once. 3 years ago, Silent Hawk and his band had struck the Morrison Ranch, running off cattle and horses. 2 years before that, they had attacked a supply wagon, leaving the driver wounded but alive, a mercy that some townspeople interpreted as weakness, others as calculated intimidation. Each incident had reinforced the community's conviction that peaceful coexistence with the Apache was impossible. Now Silent Hawk stood bound and silent on the platform where so many had met their end. He showed no fear, no plea for clemency, no acknowledgement that his life would soon be measured in minutes rather than years. His dark eyes surveyed the crowd with the same calm attention he might give to scanning the horizon for game. If he felt regret for his actions or concern for his fate, no sign of it showed on his weathered face. The townspeople who gathered to witness his execution represented every aspect of Cedar Ridge society. Ranchers and shopkeepers, the doctor and the preacher, wives and widows, children old enough to understand that justice was being served. They came not from bloodlust, but from civic duty. The shared understanding that community survival required clear consequences for those who threatened their way of life. Morrison climbed the gallows steps with measured pace, his boots echoing hollow against the wooden planks. The crowd fell silent, recognizing the solemnity of the moment. Even the children stopped their whispered conversations and fidgeting, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Silent Hawk, Morrison's voice carried clearly across the gathering. You have been found guilty of cattle theft, horse theft, and assault upon the citizens of Cedar Ridge. The sentence is death by hanging, to be carried out this morning. He paused, following the ritual he had performed only once before in his tenure as sheriff. Do you have any final words? For a long moment the Apache warrior remained silent, living up to the name the townspeople had given him. Then, in clear English that surprised many in the crowd, he spoke his first and only request. I wish to see my family. The simplicity of the request created an unexpected moment of uncertainty. Morrison had prepared for defiance, for curses in Apache, for the stoic silence that had marked Silent Hawk's 3 weeks in their jail. He had not prepared for this quiet appeal to human connection. Dr. Hamilton, standing near the front of the crowd, shifted uncomfortably. As the town's physician, he had attended enough deathbeds to recognize the universal desire for family presence in final moments. Even condemned men deserved that comfort, didn't they? Father Miguel, the Catholic priest who ministered to the town's spiritual needs, felt his own internal conflict. The church taught mercy and redemption, but it also recognized the necessity of earthly justice. How could he counsel against a request that spoke to the most basic human need? Morrison looked out over the crowd, seeing expectation in some faces, uncertainty in others. The execution had been scheduled, announced and prepared. Delay would create complications, questions, perhaps even opportunities for rescue attempts. But the request itself seemed reasonable, even honorable. How long would this take? Morrison asked, though he already knew he was opening a door that might be difficult to close. They come now, Silent Hawk replied, nodding toward the eastern approach to town where dust clouds suggested approaching riders. The timing seemed too convenient to be coincidental. Morrison realized that Silent Hawk's family had been traveling to Cedar Ridge, perhaps hoping to arrive in time for this final goodbye. The warrior's calm acceptance of his fate took on new dimension when viewed as a man preparing to leave behind those he loved. As the dust clouds resolved into 2 figures on horseback, a woman and a child, Morrison made a decision that would change everything that followed. Against his better judgment as a lawman, but in accordance with his instincts as a human being, he nodded his agreement. We'll wait. The capture of Silent Hawk had not been a straightforward affair. 3 weeks earlier, Deputy Jake Matthews had been returning from a routine patrol when he spotted smoke rising from the abandoned Henderson Place, a homestead that had been empty since the family moved back east. The previous spring, Matthews had approached cautiously, expecting to find drifters or perhaps someone sheltering from the late summer rains. Instead, he found Silent Hawk tending a small fire outside the dilapidated cabin, apparently making repairs to a broken bridle. The Apache warrior made no attempt to flee when Matthews appeared, showing neither surprise nor concern at the deputy's arrival. He simply continued his work as though a hound lawman's presence was of no particular significance. Matthews later told anyone who would listen that Silent Hawk could have easily escaped if he had chosen to do so. The warrior's horse was saddled and ready, his weapons were within reach, and the terrain offered multiple routes back into the hills where pursuit would have been difficult. Instead, he allowed himself to be taken into custody with the same calm dignity he now displayed on the gallows. In Silent Hawk's saddlebags, Matthews had found items that connected the warrior to recent thefts around Cedar Ridge, a distinctive silver bridle that belonged to Tom Wilson, leather goods that matched descriptions of items taken from the Murphy Ranch, and other evidence that seemed to confirm years of suspicion about who was responsible for the raids that had plagued the area. But Matthews also found something that didn't fit the image of a ruthless raider. A small leather pouch containing stones, dried herbs, and what appeared to be religious or ceremonial items. The medicine pouch spoke to a spiritual dimension that complicated the simple narrative of Apache as enemy. Warriors who carried medicine pouches were often leaders, spiritual guides, men respected within their communities for wisdom as well as courage. During his 3 weeks in the Cedar Ridge jail, Silent Hawk had maintained the same composed dignity that marked his capture. He accepted meals without complaint, submitted to questioning without response, and endured the curious stares of townspeople who came to see the notorious raider in captivity. Some expected him to rage against his confinement, to attempt escape, or to display the savage behavior they associated with Apache warriors. Instead, Silent Hawk spent his days in quiet contemplation, occasionally singing low chants that Father Miguel recognized as spiritual songs. The priest, who had served in New Mexico before coming to Cedar Ridge, had learned enough Apache customs to understand that Silent Hawk was preparing his soul for the journey to the afterlife. This spiritual preparation impressed even those townspeople who had no sympathy for his crimes. The evidence against Silent Hawk was substantial, but not entirely satisfying. While the stolen goods in his possession clearly linked him to recent thefts, questions remained about his role in earlier raids. Some incidents attributed to his band had occurred when reliable witnesses placed him elsewhere. Other raids showed a level of violence that seemed inconsistent with his careful behavior in custody. Hamilton had examined Silent Hawk upon his arrival at the jail, looking for wounds that might connect him to specific incidents where defenders had fought back. He found old scars consistent with a warrior's life, but no fresh injuries that would link him to recent conflict. The absence of evidence was not proof of innocence, but it added to the nagging sense that the full story was more complex than it appeared. Judge Crawford, the territorial judge who rode circuit between frontier towns, had reviewed the case during his last visit to Cedar Ridge. Crawford was known for swift justice and harsh sentences, believing that frontier communities could not afford extended legal proceedings or lenient treatment of criminals. He had examined the evidence, heard testimony from victims, and pronounced sentence without hesitation. The defendant is guilty of theft and depredation against the citizens of Cedar Ridge, Crawford had declared. The sentence is death by hanging, to be carried out at the sheriff's discretion within 30 days of this judgment. Crawford had left town the next morning, riding on to other communities that awaited his judicial services. His swift departure meant that any new evidence or complications would have to be resolved without benefit of his legal expertise. Morrison was left to carry out the sentence with whatever wisdom he could muster from his experience as a frontier lawman. The 30-day window had allowed time for Silent Hawk's spiritual preparation and for word to reach his family. Apache communication networks were extensive and efficient, carrying news across vast distances through a combination of smoke signals, messengers, and traders who moved between communities. Morrison suspected that Silent Hawk's capture had been known throughout Apache territory within days of his arrest. What Morrison had not expected was that Silent Hawk's family would risk traveling to Cedar Ridge for a final goodbye. The journey required crossing territory where Apache were not welcome, approaching a town where they might face hostility or worse. The courage required for such a journey suggested that Silent Hawk's family relationships were strong enough to overcome considerable danger and uncertainty. As the two riders approached Cedar Ridge, details became visible that surprised many in the gathered crowd. The woman rode with the confidence of someone accustomed to long distances and difficult terrain, but her clothing showed influences from both Apache and Anglo cultures. The child appeared to be perhaps 8 or 10 years old, sitting straight in his saddle with the unconscious grace of someone raised among horsemen. Most surprising was the woman's appearance as she drew close enough for facial features to be clearly visible. While her dark hair was braided in Apache fashion and her clothing bore traditional decorative elements, her skin was lighter than expected, her features more angular than the broad face typical of Apache women. Several townspeople exchanged puzzled glances, recognizing something familiar in the woman's appearance, but unable to identify exactly what seemed familiar about her. The child's features showed a similar ambiguity, suggesting mixed heritage that complicated simple categories of identity and loyalty. As Silent Hawk's wife and son dismounted near the gallows, their bearing impressed even those townspeople who had come expecting to witness the end of a criminal's life. They moved with quiet dignity, showing neither fear of the hostile crowd nor desperate emotion at the circumstances. Instead, they displayed the same composed acceptance that had characterized Silent Hawk's behavior throughout his captivity. The woman approached the gallows platform with measured steps, her son walking beside her with the serious expression of a child who understood the gravity of the situation. When she reached the base of the gallows, she looked up at Silent Hawk with eyes that held love and sorrow in equal measure, but no trace of the wild grief that many expected from an Apache woman saying goodbye to her condemned husband. Silent Hawk's wife had always been known as Morning Star among the Apache, though few in Cedar Ridge had ever heard that name spoken aloud. Her marriage to Silent Hawk 15 years earlier had been celebrated throughout their band as a union that brought together two strong spirits, two people whose individual strengths would create something greater than either could achieve alone. Morning Star had been 18 when she married Silent Hawk, already recognized for her skills in healing, her knowledge of plants and medicines, and her ability to mediate disputes within the community. Silent Hawk, 5 years older, had earned respect as a warrior and hunter, but also as a man who thought carefully before acting, who valued wisdom as much as courage. Their courtship had followed Apache customs, with Silent Hawk demonstrating his worth through gifts of horses and successful hunts, and Morning Star showing her acceptance through participation in ceremonies that bound their families together. The marriage had been blessed by the presence of both families, witnessed by the entire band, and celebrated with dancing that lasted 3 days. Little Fox, their son, had been born during their 2nd year of marriage, arriving during the season when the band camped near a river where fox tracks were plentiful in the muddy banks. His birth had been relatively easy, attended by Morning Star's mother and the other women of the band, welcomed with the joy that greeted any healthy child born to the Apache people. From his earliest days, Little Fox had shown the intelligence and curiosity that marked him as his father's son, but also the gentle nature and careful observation skills that reflected his mother's influence. By age 8, he could track game almost as well as grown men, could identify edible and medicinal plants, and could speak both Apache and the English his mother had taught him in secret. The family's life together had been marked by the seasonal rhythms that governed Apache existence, following game migrations, gathering plants and materials needed for survival, participating in ceremonies that maintained spiritual balance, and adapting to the increasing pressure from encroaching settlers and military forces. Morning Star had always been the bridge between her Apache life and the knowledge she carried from her earlier existence. She understood both worlds in ways that few people could, translating not just languages, but entire ways of thinking about relationships, land use, spiritual practices, and community organization. Little Fox had inherited his mother's ability to move between cultures, though his young life had been lived entirely within the Apache world. He spoke English with the same fluency as Apache, understood concepts from both traditions, and displayed the adaptability that would be essential for survival in a changing world. The family's journey to Cedar Ridge had required careful planning and considerable courage. They traveled mostly at night, avoiding main trails and settlements where Apache were unwelcome or actively hunted. Morning Star's knowledge of terrain and water sources, combined with Silent Hawk's training in moving undetected across hostile territory, had made the journey possible. They brought with them only what was essential: water, dried food, minimal supplies, and the items they considered necessary for spiritual purposes. Morning Star carried the silver and turquoise bracelet Silent Hawk had given her on their wedding day, a piece of jewelry that represented their unbreakable bond and her commitment to stand with him regardless of circumstances. Little Fox carried the wooden horse his father had carved for him, a toy that demonstrated the universal nature of parental love. The horse was painted with designs that told stories of successful hunts, spiritual visions, and family history. For Little Fox, the wooden horse represented security and connection to his father's protective presence. As Morning Star looked up at Silent Hawk on the gallows platform, the love between them was visible to everyone present. Despite the circumstances, despite the crowd of hostile faces, despite the rope that waited to claim his life, their connection transcended the immediate crisis. Their farewell would be conducted with the same dignity that had characterized their life together. Little Fox stepped forward and spoke in clear, careful English that surprised many in the crowd who had assumed he would speak only Apache. "Father," the boy said, his young voice carrying clearly in the morning air, "we have come to honor you and to carry your memory with us always." The simple statement, delivered with such composure by a child facing his father's execution, created an unexpected moment of silence among the gathered townspeople. Many had expected wailing and dramatic pleas for mercy. Instead, they witnessed dignity that challenged their assumptions about Apache character and culture. Silent Hawk looked down at his son with obvious pride and love. "Little Fox," he replied in English, acknowledging both his son's courage in making the dangerous journey and his wisdom in addressing the crowd in a language they could understand. "You honor our family and our people with your strength." Morning Star stepped closer to the gallows platform, and in that movement something shifted in the crowd's attention. Several older residents began to murmur among themselves, studying her face with growing recognition. Her features, her posture, something about her presence triggered memories that had been buried for years. Father Miguel, who had served Cedar Ridge for nearly 2 decades, felt a familiar stirring as he watched Morning Star's composed farewell to her condemned husband. The priest's memory reached back through years of baptisms, marriages, funerals, and other ceremonies that marked the major events in his parishioners' lives. Somewhere in that catalogue of faces and names was a connection he couldn't quite grasp, a resemblance that nagged at his consciousness without resolving into clear recognition. Morning Star's bearing, her facial structure, something about the way she held her head when listening, all of it seemed familiar in ways that had nothing to do with her Apache identity. Dr. Hamilton also found himself studying Morning Star with professional interest. His medical training had taught him to observe details that others might miss, to notice patterns and connections that could be crucial for diagnosis and treatment. What he saw in Morning Star's appearance suggested possibilities that would challenge everything the townspeople believed about the family they were preparing to destroy. The crowd's murmur grew louder as more people began to notice what Father Miguel and Dr. Hamilton had observed. Morning Star's appearance didn't fit their expectations of an Apache woman, and her composed behavior during such a traumatic moment suggested familiarity with situations that required dignity under extreme pressure. Then Father Miguel stepped forward, his wooden cross clutched in his weathered hands, a crucifix he had hand-carved years earlier as a symbol of faith that could bridge different traditions and beliefs. The priest's face showed the dawning recognition that had been building throughout the morning. "Morning Star," Father Miguel said quietly, his voice carrying just far enough to be heard by those closest to the gallows. "Would you be willing to speak with me for a moment?" The request seemed reasonable under the circumstance. Last rites and spiritual comfort were traditional parts of executions, even when the condemned and his family followed different religious practices. Morning Star nodded her agreement and walked toward the priest, Little Fox remaining close beside her. Father Miguel studied her face carefully, comparing what he saw with memories that had been stirring throughout the morning. When Morning Star drew close enough for quiet conversation, the priest asked a question that would change everything that followed. "Child," Father Miguel said gently, "what was your name before you became Morning Star?" The question caught Morning Star off guard, but only for a moment. She looked into the priest's kind eyes and saw recognition there, understanding that her secret was no longer hidden. "Sarah," she answered quietly. "Sarah Bennett." The admission, spoken barely above a whisper, nonetheless carried clearly enough for several nearby townspeople to hear. The name Sarah Bennett triggered immediate recognition among the older residents, who remembered the tragedy that had shaped their community 15 years earlier. Father Miguel closed his eyes for a moment, overwhelmed by the confirmation of what he had begun to suspect. Sarah Bennett had been one of his favorite children in the parish, a bright girl with an insatiable curiosity about the world and a natural kindness that had endeared her to everyone who knew her. Sarah had been 13 when the Apache raid took her from her family's ranch outside Cedar Ridge. Her parents had found blood on the ground, signs of struggle, and clear evidence that she had been taken alive. The entire community had organized search parties, had followed Apache trails deep into dangerous territory, had offered rewards and negotiated through intermediaries in desperate attempts to secure her return. For 2 years, Sarah's father, the town's first mayor, had continued searching, refusing to accept that his daughter might be dead. He had exhausted the family's resources, had traveled hundreds of miles following false leads and rumors, had aged visibly under the weight of hope constantly deferred. Eventually, the searchers had found what appeared to be Sarah's remains in a canyon where Apache had been attacked by cavalry troops. Scraps of her clothing, a broken piece of jewelry, and other evidence had convinced her family that their daughter was dead. They had held a funeral service, erected a headstone, and tried to rebuild their lives around the devastating loss. But Sarah Bennett had not died in that canyon. She had survived her capture, had adapted to Apache life, had eventually chosen to remain with the people who had taken her as a child. The woman now known as Morning Star was the same girl who had disappeared 15 years earlier, presumed dead by the community that had never stopped mourning her loss. Father Miguel's wooden cross trembled in his hands as he processed the implications of this discovery. The man they were preparing to hang was married to Sarah Bennett, a girl the priest had baptized, confirmed and prepared for First Communion. Their son, Little Fox, was Sarah's child, which made him the grandson of Cedar Ridge's founding family. The priest looked up at Silent Hawk, seeing him now not as an Apache raider who had terrorized their community, but as the husband of a girl Father Miguel had watched grow from childhood into adolescence. The moral complexity of the situation threatened to overwhelm the simple certainty that had brought them to this moment. Dr. Hamilton approached during this exchange, having overheard enough to understand what was being revealed. As the town's physician, he had attended Sarah Bennett's birth, had treated her childhood illnesses, had known her as a patient from her earliest days. The medical knowledge that had helped him recognize inconsistencies in her appearance now confirmed what Father Miguel had discovered through spiritual connection. Sarah Bennett, Hamilton said wonderingly, his voice carrying far enough to be heard by Mayor Bennett, Sarah's younger brother, who now held the office their father had once occupied. Mayor John Bennett pushed through the crowd, his face showing the shock of recognition that was spreading among the older townspeople. At 32, John had been 17 when his sister disappeared, old enough to remember her clearly, but young enough to have been shaped profoundly by the trauma of her loss. John stared at Morning Star, at Sarah, with an expression that cycled through disbelief, joy and confusion. The sister he had mourned for 15 years stood before him, alive and grown into womanhood, mother to a child who bore the features of both Apache and Anglo heritage. "Sarah?" John's voice broke on the name. "Is it really you?" Morning Star looked at her brother with eyes that held 15 years of separation, 15 years of living in a world he couldn't imagine, 15 years of adapting to circumstances that had shaped her into someone he barely recognized. But beneath the changes, beneath the cultural adaptations and the passage of time, the fundamental connection between siblings remained. "Hello, Johnny," she said, using the childhood nickname that confirmed her identity beyond any possible doubt. The recognition spread through the crowd like wildfire. Sarah Bennett, the mayor's daughter, the girl whose disappearance had unified the community in grief and determination, stood before them, married to the Apache warrior they had come to see hanged. Everything about the morning's proceedings suddenly seemed different. The simple narrative of justice being served to an Apache raider had become something far more complex, far more challenging to the community's sense of right and wrong. Sheriff Morrison looked down from the gallows platform, seeing his carefully planned execution dissolving into chaos as townspeople struggled to process revelations that changed everything they thought they understood about Silent Hawk, his family, and their own community's history. The story of Sarah Bennett's disappearance had become part of Cedar Ridge's collective memory, told and retold until it achieved the status of founding mythology. She had been the community's first major loss to Apache raids, the tragedy that unified scattered settlers into a determined community, committed to mutual protection and swift justice against those who threatened their safety. Sarah's father, William Bennett, had been Cedar Ridge's first elected mayor, a position he had used to organize defense against Apache raids and to advocate for military protection from territorial authorities. His tireless efforts to find his missing daughter had demonstrated the kind of determination that frontier communities required for survival, and his eventual acceptance of her death had shown the resilience needed to continue building civilization in hostile territory. The Bennett family had been among Cedar Ridge's most prominent citizens, contributing land for the church and school, providing leadership during crises, and serving as an example of the values that made frontier communities successful. Sarah's disappearance had tested those values and ultimately strengthened the community's commitment to protecting its members from external threats. William Bennett's grief over his daughter's loss had aged him prematurely, turning his brown hair silver and carving deep lines around his eyes. He had died 5 years earlier, never knowing that the daughter he had mourned was alive, married, and living as part of the Apache community he had devoted his life to opposing. Sarah's mother, Margaret Bennett, had died 3 years after her daughter's presumed death, succumbing to a fever that Dr. Hamilton privately believed was worsened by the grief that had never fully healed. Margaret had been a gentle woman who found it difficult to reconcile Christian teachings about forgiveness with the hatred she felt toward those who had taken her child. John Bennett had inherited both his father's position as mayor and the emotional burden of being the family's sole survivor. He had built his political career partly on the foundation of his family's sacrifice, using their story to advocate for stronger measures against Apache raids and better protection for frontier settlements. Now John faced the impossible task of reconciling 15 years of grief and anger with the living reality of his sister's survival and apparent contentment among the people he had been raised to consider enemies. The cognitive dissonance threatened to overwhelm his ability to process what was happening. "Sarah," John said again, as though repetition might help him accept what his eyes were showing him. "We thought you were dead. We found your clothes, pieces of your jewelry. We had a funeral. We buried an empty coffin." "Morning Star," Sarah nodded with the patient understanding of someone who had anticipated this moment for years. "The Apache who captured me gave those things to cavalry soldiers after a battle, hoping to convince everyone I was dead, so you would stop searching for me." The explanation made tactical sense from an Apache perspective. Ending the search efforts would reduce military pressure and allow the band to move more freely without constant pursuit. But the human cost of that deception had been immense, causing Sarah's family and community to suffer grief that could have been avoided. "But why didn't you try to escape? Why didn't you try to come home?" John's questions carried the pain of 15 years of wondering, 15 years of imagining what his sister might have endured, 15 years of assuming she would have returned if she had been able. Sarah looked up at Silent Hawk, drawing strength from his steady presence even as he faced his own death. "Because I found a home with them, Johnny. Because Silent Hawk's people treated me with kindness when they could have treated me as a slave, or worse. Because I fell in love with a good man who respected me and protected me." The answer challenged fundamental assumptions about Apache character and behavior. Cedar Ridge's understanding of Apache culture was based primarily on conflict situations, raids, battles, negotiations conducted under hostile circumstances. The possibility that Apache communities might be capable of kindness, integration, and genuine affection for outsiders had never seriously been considered. Hamilton approached John Bennett and spoke quietly, hoping to provide medical perspective that might help the mayor process what was happening. "John, I've been observing Sarah Morningstar throughout this morning. She shows no signs of coercion, no indication that she's being held against her will. Her behavior suggests someone who has made genuine choices about her life." Father Miguel added his own observations based on spiritual counseling experience. "The love between her and Silent Hawk is clearly genuine, and their son shows no signs of trauma or fear. This appears to be a functional family unit, not a situation of captivity or abuse." These professional assessments provided important context, but they couldn't resolve the emotional turmoil that John Bennett and the community were experiencing. Accepting that Sarah had chosen Apache life voluntarily meant questioning everything they believed about the righteousness of their opposition to Apache presence in their territory. The crowd around the gallows had grown larger as word spread through town that Sarah Bennett had returned from the dead. Shopkeepers closed their stores to witness the unprecedented situation. Women left their morning chores to see the girl they had mourned 15 years earlier. Children who had heard stories about Sarah Bennett's disappearance pressed forward to see living proof that some stories could have endings different from what everyone believed. Among the gathering crowd, reactions varied widely. Some townspeople felt joy at Sarah's survival, grateful that at least one family tragedy had a better ending than anyone had dared hope. Others felt anger at the deception that had caused years of unnecessary grief. Still others experienced confusion about what Sarah's survival meant for their understanding of Apache culture and their community's relationship with native peoples. Miss Patterson, who had been Margaret Bennett's closest friend and had attended Sarah's funeral service, pushed through the crowd with tears streaming down her face. She reached Sarah and embraced her without hesitation, 15 years of mourning replaced instantly by relief and joy. "Sarah, dear child," Mrs. Patterson sobbed, "your mother never stopped believing you might still be alive. She would be so happy to see you grown into such a beautiful woman." The embrace between Mrs. Patterson and Sarah provided a moment of pure human connection that transcended the political and cultural complications surrounding the morning's events. For just a moment, the crowd witnessed reunion and healing, rather than conflict and division. But the emotional moment also served to highlight the impossible situation they all faced. Sarah Bennett had returned from the dead, but she had returned as Morningstar, wife of the Apache warrior they had come to see execute. Her survival created joy, but it also created moral complexity that threatened to overwhelm the community's capacity for decision-making. Sheriff Morrison remained on the gallows platform, bound by law to carry out the execution, but increasingly uncertain about the righteousness of that action. The man he was preparing to hang was no longer simply an Apache raider. He was Sarah Bennett's husband, Little Fox's father, and apparently a person capable of the love and kindness that had earned Sarah's voluntary loyalty. The community faced a choice that would define their values more clearly than any previous decision in their history. They could proceed with the execution, upholding law and order, but destroying a family that included one of their own. Or they could find some way to show mercy, risking the appearance of weakness, but honoring the complexity of human relationships that transcended simple categories of friend and enemy.